Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and I am your lovely host for today. I don't know. I figured I feel good about myself, so I'll compliment myself. You know? We all deserve a self-compliment every now and then, I think. So, welcome back to the podcast. I am unaware of who you are, but regardless, I'm super glad that you've joined me. Last week we finished up our discussion on virtual reality and what that has to do with the idea of the self and how that's executed effectively in science fiction works. Though to say wrapped up is pretty presumptuous in my opinion, as I don't really think that 2 40-minute long podcasts or even conversations on that particular subject matter are really going to be sufficient to having, covered the entire breadth of the topic. But I mean, that's what the point of podcasts are, kind of abridged conversation, right? So we'll probably get back to that particular trope at some point, I'm sure, but hopefully we'll do so with some fresh eyes, or we'll do it in a little bit different way than we did last time. This week, I'm going to move on to something different entirely, which is pretty normal for podcasts, I promise, so don't worry. Last week, I mentioned that kind of like science fiction as a genre has recently come under fire as being a genre that focuses on escapism and doesn't really have anything substantial to offer in the realm of like high literature or high film. High being a pretentious way to impose some sort of like physical distance between things that are good and things that are not. So basically, science fiction to them really is just something that should be relegated to the fantasies of adolescence and like the young adult reading section in a used bookstore or a library or a regular bookstore. But this week, I'm going to kind of set out to prove why that critique is wrong. Now, I'm supposed to say in my opinion, but I think factually that it is wrong. But in my opinion, I think that it's wrong. And I'm going to kind of outline my points and my reasoning behind why I think science fiction is actually one of like the higher forms of art. And fantasy as well. And in order to do that, I'm going to kind of give just a brief history of science fiction as well as kind of like just some little tidbits, I guess, bullet points. I guess they're more than bullet points. I'm just going to kind of make an argument that this genre really is worthy of praise and academic study and academic consideration. So, kind of just to get started, the beginnings of science fiction are often attributed to turn-of-the-century literature based on conjecture of the advancement of industrialization. So, early 1900s, late 1800s, 19th to 20th century, when the Civil War was over, Reconstruction, industrialization is kind of able to advance faster because of the social influencers that are involved and other aspects, economic well-being and things like that had kind of been restored after a long period of conflict in the United States. And the United States is pretty much like the focal point for science fiction. They have by far produced the most material in the on that particular subject matter. And that is in part due to the fact that we have more industrialization here in America than most other parts of the world, but we'll probably get to that a little bit later. And the reason that all of that is important is because science fiction is pretty much exclusively developed by countries that are experiencing surplus or industrialization or have been able to kind of move their attention and their creativity from the struggles of surviving in their current world and then hypothesizing what struggles they may have to deal with that are the results of the advancements that the society around them and the culture around them are experiencing. And while the science fiction of the early 1900s is what we as consumers are most familiar with stylistically, science fiction as a genre has actually been around for a lot longer than 100 years. Some scholars would credit the beginning of science fiction to Greek philosophers or Greek thinkers who wrote about traveling to the moon, and there are stories about Atlantis that occur later after the Christianization of Europe. The introduction of the ideas of utopia and dystopia into like popular literature and the general zeitgeist of their times are good places to consider for the beginnings of science fiction. But because science fiction as a genre is ultimately really vague and difficult to define, which we'll probably talk about at some point, it is understandable that its origins would be equally vague and difficult to define. So a number of individuals, both inside and outside of academia, have attempted to tackle this problem. And while there are a number of conjectures out there, that problem being the definition of science fiction, I would say that possibly the most succinct came from this YouTube video that I was watching on this subject, actually. Their definition was as follows. Science fiction is defined as any literature or material that contains the idea of novum. Novum is a Latin word that translates literally as new thing. But I don't really think that the presence of a new thing is what constitutes science fiction. But there's a little bit more to this particular statement. And in order to understand that a little bit more, we're going to talk about a term called cognitive estrangement. On the surface level, the idea of cognitive estrangement is basically, it's kind of like an alternative way to say suspension of disbelief, which is a phrase that I've used quite frequently on this podcast. Suspension of disbelief, just as kind of a refresher, is the practice that we as consumers of art use in order to give credence to ideas that seem beyond our current understanding or are fantastic in comparison to our current perception of reality. In contrast, cognitive estrangement refers more to the foundations of suspension of disbelief in terms of science fiction specifically. Cognitive estrangement specifically refers to the concept of familiarity and hypothetical conclusions drawn based on that familiarity. So, kind of like a layman's way to look at this would be like a lightsaber. Actually, a lightsaber versus a laser pointer, right? Because you need something to compare it to. They're both lasers. One does something completely different than the other and functions in like a completely different way. But when we go to read Star Wars lore and they tell us, oh, it's light that's refracted through this specific crystal and there's a capacitor and blah, 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 blah. Like cognitive estrangement is that appeal to things that are familiar to us in order to justify the existence of something that is otherwise unfamiliar. So we will have a higher likelihood of buying into the existence of that thing if there's some sort of basis for familiarity with the things that make that particular item or technology or setting function. So it's defined specifically by academics as follows. A narrative logic that uses familiar aspects of science to justify the function of particular technologies or setting. Another really good example of this could be like the original Star Trek. which introduced the idea of a smartphone, kind of, because it had these like very small multifunctional communication devices that also served as like miniature handheld computers and scanners. Star Trek used the idea of computers and phones, scientifically and socially common ideas, right? Because we all know that phones exist. We use phones every day. We are all aware of the existence of computers, and at that time people are fascinated by what scientists can do with them. And then the creators of Star Trek do something like fantastic with them by making them not only wireless but also like pocket-sized and multifunctional. And this is a great example of cognitive estrangement. Another good way to conceptualize this is to compare it to the idea of déjà vu. Ultimately, you're experiencing or conceptualizing something that you believe yourself to have experienced before, despite having no memory of it. It relies ultimately on a really similar faculty, taking something that is familiar and using it as a method of disassociation to ultimately create familiarity and solicit buy-in from the audience. So just so that we're on the same page, before we get into kind of like my arguments as to why this particular aspect of science fiction is important in justifying its presence in like high literature and high art, I just wanted to kind of go over some definitions of what people define science fiction as, and mention this one because I feel like it does do at least a decent job of giving us a good basis to go off of. We'll get more into why this is important, but that'll be right after this commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. Right before the break, we were talking about the idea of cognitive estrangement and suspension of disbelief. So just to kind of continue on that same particular topic, suspension of disbelief and cognitive estrangement are essentially a Venn diagram when it comes to science fiction that, in my opinion, kind of shares a third circle with like fantasy. Because fantasy is a genre that relies heavily on suspension of disbelief. Without it, things like Harry Potter wouldn't have been popular at all. The difference, and ultimately this is the defining line between genres, is the function of science in the story. And where the three of these things overlap, that being science fiction, cognitive estrangement, and fantasy, is that the reader or the person watching the movie or what have you has to be made to believe in something that is fantastic or beyond conception, and that thing is necessary to the story. A good example for us to kind of like cross genres and get like a compare and contrast thing going would be the idea of the reanimation of the deceased in fantasy novels versus science fiction novels. In fantasy, the dead are often reanimated via like a magical means or have some sort of metaphysical necessity which binds them to a mortal plane of existence, kind of like the undead in Lord of the Rings. Whereas in science fiction, often the cause of this undeath is like a virus or some other form of scientific phenomena that causes zombification. The difference here primarily is the function of familiar concepts in science versus a lack of explanation via scientific means. as well as the story's reliance on that explanation. And what we're kind of talking about here is the difference between like a fantasy book and a science fiction book that are both using the same overall idea to portray something, but what makes one science fiction and one fantasy, and we'll get to why that's important to what it is that I'm, overall arguing about today, and that being that fantasy and science fiction, mainly science fiction, are worthy of being considered a part of high literature. So back to what I was saying before about reanimation of the dead. So a good example or a comparison for this particular instance, so that we just kind of have some help in defining what it is that cognitive estrangement is versus just a regular suspension of disbelief and things like that. It would be to compare like I Am Legend, which is more closely aligned with science fiction, to something like The Walking Dead. I Am Legend relies on a scientific explanation and in part the scientific method to drive the purpose and metaphor of the story. Whereas The Walking Dead uses a virus to kind of like casually explain an aspect of the setting, which is used to solicit conflict. Both are ultimately science fiction. I'm not trying to say that The Walking Dead isn't, but one serves primarily to focus on the defining factors of humanity, and the other serves to comment on the relationships of individuals within that humanity. And since we're specifically going to be talking about some comments that were made about like comic books and comic book fans, perhaps a more pertinent example would be like Spider-Man versus Wonder Woman. It's not as if someone couldn't explain Wonder Woman's powers, maybe minus the lasso of truth, maybe the invisible jet. It's not like you couldn't explain those things with by scientific means. But the primary function of her story is not to reflect on where or why her function, meaning her powers, were granted to her. Whereas in Spider-Man, a substantial amount of conflict and character development is motivated by Peter Parker's acquisition of his powers. Now, I mentioned that we were going to be kind of addressing something specific or some critique specifically leveled at superheroes. I would also like to mention that superheroes are kind of one of the best genre-bending examples to use for genre-defining arguments, because they kind of exist in multiple spaces at the same time, which I think is really interesting. So Spider-Man can have a science fiction and a fantasy and whatever other genre aspect to it at any given point in time, which I think is pretty cool. But the comments that I kind of want to focus on that are kind of they're basically along the same lines of what people have been saying about science fiction and fantasy for decades. It's since the inception of science fiction. People have been making comments like this about it. But specifically, we're going to kind of talk about the comments that were made as a critique that was leveled against the popularity of comic book movies. And these comments came from popular pundit Bill Maher, which his last name is hilarious to me because I always think of that character from the Amanda Show who go like Maher, and so I always want to say his name like Maher. Anyway, I think that's funny. So Bill Maher's comments are, of course, they're not the only critique of fantasy or science fiction out there. Last week I linked to an article that talked about something like rather similar, but it was a little bit more specific to science fiction and a little bit more specific to psychology. And I'm not bringing up Bill Maher's comments necessarily to specifically address them, but more to address the idea that fantastic ideas in storytelling are simply elements of escapism. This is basically what he's arguing, not what I'm arguing. He's saying that fantastic elements and ideas in storytelling are a form of escapism, and they're not a storytelling methodology that can solicit a deeper understanding of the human experience. And Bill Maher even goes so far as to say that the storytelling mechanics of comic books are incapable of portraying an accurate depiction of the human experience in the form of like the struggles that that individuals go through and things like that, which is, in my opinion, a pretty hyperbolic and inflammatory statement. But hey, you do you, Bill Maher. But just to make sure that we're on the same page before we continue moving forward, I know that I do that a lot. It's really important to make sure that we're talking about the same terms, and so that there's no, you're not thinking that this word means one thing and I'm talking about it differently and now you're confused. So real quick, just want to go over the term escapism. The word is generally used to refer to the practice of distancing oneself from the more unpleasant realities of everyday life, like boredom, sadness, depression. And I want to just mention at the top here that I don't think that escapism as a coping mechanism is necessarily automatically a bad thing. I think that escapism can be used as a coping mechanism and can be practiced in a healthy way. But I don't think that it has a place when it comes to science fiction or even fantasy most of the time. I think escapism refers to a personal or individualized practice that has nothing to do with the intent of the author or creator of a particular piece of content, and has more to do with the use of that content by an individual. So to say that science fiction is a form of escapist literature, in my opinion, implies that it was written with the intent to escape something about life and not examine something true about life, which is why I think that the word doesn't really have a place in a critique of fantasy or science fiction. But before we continue kind of down this rabbit trail, we're going to take another quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, welcome back. We're back. I wish I could say that was the last commercial break, but there's probably one more. Anyway, they're not that bad, right? So before we went to the break, we were talking about the idea of escapism and why it doesn't really have a place as far as a critique of science fiction or fantasy or even comic books, in my personal opinion, is concerned. And my primary reasoning behind denying the use of that particular word in literary or content critique is that escapism is ultimately a myopic way to comment on fantastic ideas. It serves more as an incendiary statement to insult the consumer of a medium than it does to actually say something important about a piece of media. I believe that escapism is often improperly conflated with an idea that I would call cognitive distance. And now this is the point where all of the stuff that I talked about before finally becomes relevant. I apologize that it took this long. Prior to this, during the first couple sections of the podcast, we spent a fair amount of time defining terms like cognitive estrangement, suspension of disbelief, defining science fiction as a whole, right? And the reason that all of that is pertinent, in my opinion, is because when we get to this point where I'm kind of going to describe my own reasoning, use my own kind of term, we needed to know all of those other things so that we could kind of see this argument in the specific way that I intended for it to be seen, because cognitive distance relies on the presence of cognitive estrangement and the type of buy-in that is necessitated by the presence of cognitive estrangement. Now, of course, like all things under the sun, this term that I'm kind of like trying to coin, I guess, for lack of another phrase, it's used in another capacity. So the most colloquial use of the term cognitive distance is a mental conceptualization of physical distance that is otherwise inconceivable from a single vantage point and necessitates a movement through the environment to achieve comprehension. A good way to kind of like conceptualize what they're defining cognitive distance as is the idea of light years. Light years is such an unfamiliar, kind of like unfathomable distance that often the only way to perceive of the idea is to mentally envision ourselves traveling through space. So if you were to close your eyes and just kind of like think of yourself as like, oh, I'm going to travel out to the Milky Way. You aren't going to think about, oh, I'm standing here and watching or just looking and then going out to the Milky Way. You're going to imagine yourself like quasi-physically moving your vantage point through the universe to get to the Milky Way. You'll pass the moon, you'll pass Mars, blah, 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 blah. Right? So that is the idea of cognitive distance. So to put this into perspective, the Earth is and this is it's a lot of zeros, so bear with me. 0.000000000001396th of a light year in diameter. So in this regard, in order for us to conceive of a light year, we absolutely have to imagine the distance in some concrete way that is ultimately not based in perception, and it's not that way in actuality. We have to visualize the distance via a conceptual or mental means. I can't think a light year is this long readily. I mean, I can if I'm super familiar with the measurement, but most of us aren't going to think that way. So this is just kind of, again, it's an example. It's not flawless, of course. It'd be nice if it was. But we have to visualize this distance in a way that like we can comprehend. And while the use of that phrase cognitive distance isn't quite exactly the same using it in the same capacity, I apologize for all the stuttering, using it in the same capacity that I would be, I think it kind of does serve a convenient purpose in illustrating my point. For my purposes, cognitive distance, in the capacity I'm attempting to use it in, refers specifically to the idea of cognitive dissonance and the way in which science fiction allows for the elimination of cognitive dissonance via distance and cognitive estrangement. So here we go with another term that we have to define. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological term that refers to the discomfort that is experienced when an individual holds two or more counterintuitive ideas at the same time while simultaneously acting in a way that does not align with those ideas. A good way to think about this would be like an individual who cares deeply for animals and believes them worthy of humane treatment, but still consumes meat that is not proven to have been humanely treated or slaughtered. Kind of like an extreme example would be like someone who says they're vegan and believes they're vegan but still eats veal, right? And cognitive dissonance is something that we experience really, like, quite frequently. We experience it almost every single day. In every action, we're constantly weighing our perception of the world with the reality of the world and our ability to actualize our beliefs into the world around us. This dissonance and discomfort that we experience on a regular basis makes it really difficult for us to address some of the more like metaphysic or profound aspects of what it is that makes us human. And it makes it really difficult for us to pursue like self-actualization. And this is why the idea of cognitive distance is so valuable, in my opinion. I just want to emphasize, I'm not saying, before we get into this illustration, I'm not saying that knowledge is quantifiable, right? But just for the purposes of the discussion, I want to attempt to conceptualize something, to like really empathize with an idea here. So we're going to do our best to kind of like imagine ourselves as being an individual in the 60s when Star Trek first aired. And think about just like the minuscule amount of technology that you have throughout your day that is like computerized or has anything to do with like robots or electronics. Like you have a lot of your standard appliances, and there were some pretty interesting technological advancements at the time, but you don't have smartphones, you don't have anything. And think of how fantastic it would be, now that you're kind of in that headspace, to think that you would be able to not only carry a phone around with you in your pocket, which at this point was still attached to your wall with a cord, if you even had one, but also a computer, which at the time was literally the size of a formal dining room. Like the first computers were huge, and they're carrying around a phone and a computer in their pocket. And not only is it a computer, it's a computer that has greater amount of function than like any computer that they currently conceptualized, because it was actually able to be used pragmatically. Another way to think about this in a more modern context would be for us to kind of like think about something that would be fantastic to us in like a current context. So there is this science fiction series out there. I think it's a board game or a role-playing game. I'm not totally sure. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But the main premise is that biology is no longer a necessity for life. When you're born, you're essentially uploaded into a completely digital world. So think about how fantastic that particular idea is. And in order to do that, we have to create a distance between our current perception of reality and the reality that we're attempting to imagine or empathize with. So the colloquial usage of the phrase cognitive distance is actually pretty appropriate as we move towards understanding something that may come to fruition, which a lot of things in science fiction have come to fruition. We're going to use that as a way to conceptualize a new point of view from which to examine a possible future. And because of this distance, we get to adopt an alternative vantage point from which to attempt to understand the world, to understand experience, and to ultimately understand the human condition. And there's a little bit more to cover. We'll get to that right after this quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast. Right before the break, we were kind of just finishing up, or I guess just starting to finally getting to a definition on the phrase cognitive distance, which I am using to describe the phenomena that occurs with the presence of a fantastic idea that uses cognitive estrangement and necessitates a suspension of disbelief. what I'm saying or trying to imply is that there is a cognitive distance between us and an actualization of that particular thing, that belief, that setting, that technology. And by creating that distance, it's forcing us to have distance from other things that we would otherwise be familiar with. It puts us in a place of vulnerability, a place of openness, because we are buying into something that is fantastic because it is necessitated by the story. And this is where I think like one of the most valuable aspects of science fiction as a genre is, right? I think its ability to distance us from our perception of the world around us is probably one of its most redeeming qualities. Science fiction, fantasy, comic books, they all necessitate cognitive estrangement in order to create or solicit a suspension of disbelief, which can be aided by the use of cognitive estrangement. And what this distance, this estrangement, this buy-in all does is force us to create cognitive distance from the cognitive dissonance of our own existence and the cognitive dissonance that we would experience otherwise when we're analyzing the believability of a story. By going to an extreme level of cognitive estrangement, we are kind of forcing someone, a science fiction author is forcing someone out of that place of dissonance. And while that cognitive distance isn't really like quantifiable, we can't say that it's the same as like the cognitive distance that's created when you are conceptualizing a light year. In a way, metaphorically, those two things are intrinsically related. And I think that part of what makes this cognitive distance so useful in science fiction is because of the presence of cognitive estrangement, because it is ultimately like an experience or a concept that we are relatively familiar with, that we must then distance ourselves from, or, conceptualize the advancements to a different version of that thing or an alien version of that thing. And that distance in relation to familiarity is what allows for there to be kind of like this return to the human experience that helps eliminate that cognitive dissonance, because we're returning to something familiar after having conceptualized it as something unfamiliar. And that distance is only created via the mechanics that are inherent to science fiction or fantasy storytelling. And without this cognitive distance that's created by our gap in understanding and the concept being portrayed to us via storytelling mechanics, quite often the commentary or messaging behind a story would be too close to our own understanding for us to conceptualize it completely. I mean, like, imagine if Star Wars was just about people who rode horses and then had telekinetic powers. Like, we'd have a lot harder time thinking of it as being like an interesting and compelling hero's journey. Another great example of this would be to think about the Kurt Vonnegut novel Player Piano, which was super revolutionary, and it relies on the idea that automation has taken over the world so completely that individuals are now passive agents in regards to economic production, and they don't have jobs anymore. But this book was written, or rather published, nearly 25 years prior to the concept of a home computer, let alone the idea of a computer or a robot that's capable of complex production processes. The cognitive distance that an individual is able to achieve in reading this novel and being required to conceptualize the ideas within it necessitates a heuristic approach to the themes and tropes of the story and an empathetic approach to the characters and their development. And now, any good story does that, but what makes science fiction better at it than other genres is that cognitive distance created by the necessity for a more substantial suspension of disbelief is more advantageous for the conceptualization of aspects of the human experience and of self-actualization actualization. Comic books and other fantasy-related genres do this really well, too. Okay, so that's the first part of this whole discussion. I had mentioned at the top that we were going to do like a brief history of science fiction so that we could understand how it's been critiqued and why it's currently being critiqued. It's continued to be critiqued. The science fiction that we're most familiar with, as I mentioned at the top, was developed in large part because of the rapid industrialization and increase in population that occurred in the United States. Because of the economic power created by these two factors, and them coinciding with the popular publication of science fiction stories, science fiction throughout the world has been really heavily influenced by like the Western conception of science fiction. Basically, it's been commercialized. There were previous iterations of science fiction that probably could have taken root, but in some ways they were even more fantastic. And part of the reason I'm even mentioning them is because some of them were written by like really famous people, like Voltaire, the French philosopher and commentator, and Francis Bacon, who was also a philosopher. They're just two examples of people who wrote like crazy science fiction stories, which I think is hilarious because nobody mentions that to you. And I think those stories, they're kind of, they don't make a ton of sense and they're not as accessible. We would have had to have like a different kind of influencing, or a different set of influencing factors in order for those to be popularized. But I mostly just wanted to mention that Francis Bacon and Voltaire wrote science fiction books. I just think that's funny. But in the 20th century, a gentleman by the name of Hugo Gernsback discovered that there was a substantial demand for science fiction stories when he began publishing Amazing Stories, real creative, right? Which was a literary magazine that focused solely on science fiction. The popularity of this magazine, of course, spawned a number of competitors who modeled their magazines after Gernsback's model. Because of this, science fiction became a commercialized pop/pulp medium that was designed to be easily consumable. Think of it kind of like network television. Not that science fiction and fantasy didn't receive plenty of criticism prior to this like pulpification process, but this time period for the early days of science fiction really detracts from its ability to effectively portray some of the more profound examinations of human experience. And because this time period coincides with that being the early 1900s, coincides with a ton of economic, social, political, academic, technological advancements, the juxtaposition that is created by, making this like pop science fiction solicits and contributes pretty heavily to like the overall disdain for the genre that is kind of still carried on into today. One of the articles that I was reading, I don't even know if I'd call it an article, it was like an essay. One of the essays I was reading in preparation for this podcast was literally titled like Coming Out of the Science Fiction Closet, and it was an individual who was basically saying that they hid their love for this genre for decades because if they were to admit that they liked it, they would have been like lambasted and overlooked for a bunch of academic positions, which I think is just crazy. But I think that's going to be a good place for us to kind of like take a break this week. We covered a lot of ground in this discussion, and I think I'm going to finish up on this topic next week, and we'll probably get like more clear on what makes science fiction. I know we've talked about it before, but I want to kind of homogenize the ideas, I guess would be a good way to put it. And I think it'll still yield like a fruitful discussion, even though I think I've only done like 6 episodes and we're already going to talk about something I already talked about. But I think I said I wouldn't mention Star Wars anymore. I've mentioned it like twice today. I'm going to mention it again at the end of the podcast. So, bam, I guess. So just to summarize my argument against the critique that science fiction does not qualify as high literature, I would have to say that my main point is that because science fiction relies primarily on the necessity of cognitive distance to mitigate cognitive dissonance that occurs during self-examination and actualization, science fiction serves as a better genre for the examination of the human race and of the individual. So that is to say, the fantastic/futuristic ideas of science fiction force individuals to have more substantial suspension of disbelief when it comes to consuming a piece of science fiction media, which allows for them to delve deeper into the self and examine aspects of it that would otherwise be inaccessible. Essentially, science fiction and other high fantasy creates a quasi-dream state that pulls back the veil of the ego and allows us to get to the superego and the id via the storytelling mechanics intrinsic to science fiction. But that's about all I've got on that particular subject this week. Real quick before we go, did want to mention I watched the video about the new High Republic Star Wars story outline story that dropped. I'm relatively excited. I'm kind of bummed. I was hopeful that when Disney took over Star Wars that they would kind of take, a more intellectual look at the universe and not just kind of stick with the basic dichotomy of good versus evil. And then when they eliminated the original extended universe books and said those are no longer canon, that was a big bummer for me as well, because I loved the Yuuzhan Vong series and the Thrawn trilogy. I think it's Thrawn. Just tell me in the comments if I'm wrong and it's not the Thrawn trilogy. But regardless, in watching the video, they're kind of going to go back to this basic Jedi are good, these people are evil, the Republic is this nice city state that's still in development, and it'll be kind of cool. The character design is nothing revolutionary for Star Wars. They even brought back the guy who designed Darth Maul, which is cool. I'm not complaining. It's just I don't think it's going to really bring anything interesting or unique that we haven't already seen before, and it might all be good content. I don't want to lambast it before it even comes out, but in my opinion, it just kind of looks like another set of potentially interesting things that Disney will use to make money on this giant cash cow that is Star Wars. So, don't mean to be a negative Nancy. Those are just my thoughts. Just want to thank everybody again for joining me this week. Really look forward to finishing this discussion next week. I hope that you'll be back, and I hope that you enjoyed today's discussion as well. Feel free to leave a comment, leave a review. Hopefully it's 5 stars. We love 5-star reviews. Subscribe. Click the like button. I don't think I said that one yet. Tweet at us. Follow us on social media. Other than that, thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.